once was a woman who was grateful for her life and wanted everything to continue just as it was. It couldn't, of course, and one July morning, when she awakened, she found she was in the ICU. She had fallen asleep in a reclining chair beside her son's bed, and her legs were cramping. She was afraid. There he lay, her only child, a young man about to begin his life, hooked up to an IV, and his blood count was dangerously low. The hospital was in a small village in New Hampshire, the town closest to the monastery, where mother and son had come to participate in a meditation retreat. It was on the first morning of the first day that the young man had suddenly collapsed. They were far from home and its comforts, far from anyone who knew them, having just arrived from San Francisco the night before. Instead of waiting for an ambulance to take them to the hospital in the nearby town, one of the brown-robed monks was assigned to drive them in one of the monastery vehicles, an old Honda. It was raining lightly as they set out, and the monk was very soon lost on the country roads, dense with a canopy of greenery that appeared blurred through the window of the back seat, where Jane Green, the mother, was sitting, her son lolling in the front. The monk apologized to the terrified mother and her gravely ill son. Monks rarely left the monastery once they had passed through its gates. The monastery had very little to do with the village where the hospital was situated, or with any town, being entirely self-contained. The place was cut off from the world, deep in the woods, in the middle of nowhere. When they finally arrived at their emergency room, the boy was examined and immediately admitted to the ICU. When it was clear that he was going to have to remain in the hospital, the monk went back to the monastery, promising to stay in touch. That was the day before yesterday, and mother and son were still here. No one seemed to know when the young man would be well enough to leave. In the meanwhile, they told the mother she was welcome to sleep in this chair in his room, and they had brought her some blankets. Why were they here? Since the boy would soon be leaving his mother to go to college, or so they believed, they had wanted to sit in silence one last time together before he departed into his life. The mother, Jane Green, was a practitioner of meditation, as was the son, Alex, though he, as of only recently. Although it was far from home, it had long been Jane's desire to participate in a retreat at this venerable monastery, but she had never applied to come before, never dreaming she would be admitted, as the place was notoriously difficult to get into. Once accepted, however, everything was free, and each practitioner was given a room to sleep in, 3 vegetarian meals a day, and his or her own cabin, his or her own personal psychic space in which to meditate. Jane hadn't had much hope that they would take her. What were her merits, after all? She wasn't a very distinguished acolyte, and her work as a university professor made it impossible for her to go, except in the summer, when the competition for places during the monastery's practice periods was most fierce. When she was admitted with her son, she suspected it was because of the boy's merits, because of the beautiful essay he had written in his application, because of his innocence and the purity of his soul. She had been overjoyed when the letter had come, offering them both a complete scholarship, but they had only been at the rustic center one night and one morning when Alex suddenly rose from his cushions, stumbled out of the lakeside gazebo where they were sitting, began to throw up, and then collapsed. Jane had followed him out the screen door and onto the grass, and she supported him while he doubled over and vomited a thick, dark liquid that looked like coffee. He's vomiting coffee, she thought. The coffee he drank that morning that had soured in his empty stomach because he hadn't eaten anything with it. When he refused breakfast, she now remembered, she'd felt the first inkling of alarm because she had never seen him refuse food before. The monastery breakfast was famously delicious, too. She herself had enjoyed a generous portion of oatmeal ladled from the black pot and sprinkled with toasted sesame seeds mashed up with salt. He's off his feet, she thought, supporting him while he vomited. He might be coming down with something. She didn't want this to be happening. She didn't want to miss the retreat. This might be their last trip together. The son was all the woman had. She'd raised him more or less by herself. The boy's father, her ex-husband, had died of a stroke 2 years after they divorced, when their son was a sophomore in high school. Alex had mourned him deeply, even though he'd not been very much for the boy, having remarried and moved on. Jane had had the support, however, of her spiritual community in raising him. As a concession to his mother, Alex, the boy, had remained in San Francisco for his first 2 years of university, but both knew he would have to leave eventually. He's not dying, her friends said glibly to her when they learned he was going off to the Midwest in his junior year, rebuking her for her sadness at his impending departure. But to her, it felt like it was going to be a kind of death. Coffee grounds, the doctor had said when they arrived at the hospital, and Jane had felt smug in her diagnosis, not knowing then that coffee grounds was the term meant to describe the vomiting of blood. He was bleeding internally, and they didn't know why. A scope uncovered an ulcer in his upper GI tract, caused, it was finally surmised, by his consumption of ibuprofen, which he had taken to excess to alleviate pain in his left knee, injured playing basketball. Now he would stop taking that medicine. They would give him several transfusions, and as soon as his blood levels were safe, mother and son would forget about the monastery and the retreat and fly home. When a few days had passed, after her son was given his 5th transfusion, Jane spoke with his university. She needed to inform them that Alex was not going to be able to start in the fall. He would need some time at home to regain his strength. They were quite decent about it and agreed to allow him to start in the winter rather than the fall. Indeed, they said they encouraged students to defer admission until the spring semester to have time to travel, to see the world, before settling down to examining it. There was a silver lining in this circumstance for Jane. She would have 6 extra months with Alex at home. She had been given a 6-month reprieve, a stay of execution, she thought to herself, jokingly. But it was no joke, she thought, as she pushed Alex's wheelchair to the gate at Logan Airport 5 days later, behind 2 doddering old people, also in wheelchairs, lined up to board. On that flight, she had a window seat, and the view from the window of the plane was spectacular. All the squares with circles in them below, all the twisting rivers and the clouds floating over the flat Midwest, where her son would be going at the start of the spring term. By then, these green and brown fields might be covered in snow. The plane made a stop in Los Angeles and then made its way up the coast toward San Francisco. And as it did, Jane admired the California clouds floating below them as her son played a game on his computer in the seat next to hers, pale but already stronger, his thick black hair falling over his forehead, his full pink lips puckering in concentration. And she watched as the clouds below mixed with fog and billowed along the coast, changing from white to gray, and then to a strange brown, with a red glow rising up through them. How lovely, Jane thought, but then suddenly knew there was a fire below, down below in Big Sur. People were evacuating on the coast highway. Someone was losing his home, and someone was perishing in the flames. But Jane and her son Alex were high above all that, all the smoke and the roiling clouds, safe and on their way home. That was all Jane knew.